Morning.
All right, Bob, you should now have the ability. Maybe, hopefully. There we go.
Okay, have you got it?
Yes, we can see it. So
Okay.
Bob will be our first Zoom meeting speaker in history.
All right, you ready for me to start? Okay, this is just going to be a brief presentation based on a book that I'm reading. The title of it is on the screen now. It's a book that I saw that came out just recently, and it interested me just from its title. So I bought it and have been reading it. It's really a book about how science evolved, especially the field of chemistry, and how the collaboration between different people and the competition, and whether science should be open or closed. It's really the evolution of science in this area that the book talks about in the context of the elements and various chemical compounds. So it's a fascinating book. It's kind of a tough read in places because it's a lot of, the author does an excellent job of going back to original sources. I mean, these are 14th, 15th century texts, which read really difficult if you've read any of those. And so he quotes them verbatim, and it takes some time to understand exactly what they're talking about. But still, it's a fascinating story, and I'm just going to talk about the first chapter of the book. And so it's the relationship between astrology and alchemy. And he puts a quote in the book from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. And this is written in the 14th century. And in there, it talks about the seven bodies. The seven bodies, view them here anon. Sol gold, and Luna we maintain as silver. Mars is iron, Mercury we call quicksilver, Saturn is lead, and Jupiter is tin, and Venus copper on my family's honor. So this is the 14th century, and they're talking about the planets and the metals known in antiquity. There's 7 metals, and so they're connecting these. So the 7 heavenly bodies were recognized by the Babylonians 3,000 years ago. So the idea that there were these heavenly bodies moving around and not in fixed places in the heavens was well known. Ptolemy, of course, you all are familiar with his idea that the Earth is the center of the solar system and the planets all revolve around the Earth. So you can see from that diagram his concept of what the geocentric view of the solar system would be like. So there were 5 planets known during antiquity, but they also considered the sun and the moon planets. So 7 altogether. And the word planets comes from the Greek for wanderers. They're wanderers because they're moving through the sky, not fixed in place like the other stars. And so the ancients in antiquity thought that there was a link between the planets and the metals that they mined and knew about on the Earth. And there were 7 key metals, gold, silver, iron, quicksilver, which is mercury, lead, tin, and copper. So here's a woodcut from 1624, which shows a depiction of the 7 metals. And the consensus was that of which planet was related to which metal was achieved in about the 15th century. Now, not everyone agreed that the planets were related to the metals on the Earth, but most of the I guess call them scholars, most of the enlightened people at that time thought that the planets seeded the Earth with these metals. There were corpuscles that were sent from these planets to the Earth, and that's how these metals got into the Earth. And so we were constantly being replenished by these metals from these planets. And so they were trying to decide which planet did which metal come from. The quote at the bottom is from 1650, "Nothing grows without seed, for where there is no seed, the thing is dead." And so they thought that metals were just like plants or trees. If God created seeds to help trees to grow, why wouldn't he have done it for metals? So their concept was that metals grew, and they grew from seeds that came from the planets. They only knew 5 planets plus the sun and the moon. And so they were trying to associate the metals that they knew in antiquity with what planets they knew. So let's go through the 7 metals and just some of the characteristics. Gold was considered the perfect metal. Its ancient symbol was that of a perfect circle. And it was considered perfect because it never tarnished. It was always brilliant. It lasted seemingly forever. It was resistant to the most common acid that was used, aqua fortis, which is nitric acid. Nitric acid dissolves all of the other 6 metals, but it doesn't dissolve gold. They did find out, however, though, that a mixture of nitric acid and hydrochloric acid would dissolve gold. That was called aqua regia. So that's how you could tell that gold was authentic, by whether it could be dissolved by this mixture of acids. So all other metals in the ground were thought to mature and eventually decay into or evolve into gold. Gold was the perfect metal. And so that was the goal of alchemists, was to discover how to accelerate that process of having all these other metals turn into gold. And so you think about alchemists trying to turn lead into gold. Well, that's exactly what they were trying to do. They thought that this was a natural process that occurred in the ground, and they just had to figure out how to do that. And so they were searching for ways to turn all these other metals, the imperfect metals, into gold. Now, we use a different system, of course, to describe the elements today. They didn't know what elements were. They were just working with ores that had different things in them, and discovering that they were made up of a combination of things. And it's that process of discovery that led the alchemists to work on various aspects. Usually they tried to dissolve it, they tried to heat it, they did all kinds of different things just to try to break it down and see what came out of it. So now we use a different terminology. Of course, you're all familiar with the chemical names for most of the elements. Gold is Au, aurum, it's the Latin word. That system came about from Berzelius, a Swedish chemist. So that's the nomenclature we use, but it's not the nomenclature the ancients, or they used in antiquity. They used symbols like the circle, the perfect circle, to describe gold. So silver was the closest thing to perfection other than gold. And the only reason it was the closest thing to perfection is that they had not yet discovered platinum. Platinum has even better characteristics, but platinum wasn't discovered until several centuries later. So silver has the color of the moon, and it was named after the Roman goddess of the moon, Luna. And so its Latin name is argentum. The abbreviation is AG. There were a lot of different silver compounds that were used for treating various diseases. We get words like lunatic and lunacy from Luna, from the moon, and silver compounds were used in a variety of medicinal, for a variety of medicinal purposes, like lunar caustic with silver nitrate used to cauterize wounds. As an aside, Argentina is the only country to be named after an element. Thought that was interesting. There's another chemical that was not one of the elements of antiquity, selenium. Selenium is interesting because it's named after Selena, who's the Greek goddess of the moon. Some of these goddesses are Greek, some of them are Roman, depends upon which one the chemists or the alchemists picked. But Selena is the Greek goddess of the moon. And the alchemist that discovered selenium found it as a contaminant of another ore that he was trying to break apart and find out what it was made up of. And he found this strange element that seemed to change colors in the light. So it seemed to respond to light. And so he conceived it of waxing and waning like the light of the moon. And so he decided to name it after the Greek goddess of the moon, Selene. Well, it turns out that selenium is electrically conductive. It's activated by light. And what he was seeing was the changes in response to light by selenium. And what do we use selenium for today? We use it as a photodetector in light meters. So he knew exactly what it did, and many centuries later, it was used. Excuse me, I get my phone. Should have unplugged my phone before I got here. Okay. So that's related to silver, named after, again, the goddess of the moon. So an interesting sidelight. Selenium was discovered in 1817, so much later. Mercury, one of the other 7 metals of antiquity, is the only one that still has its name for both the element, the god, and the planet. So they're all called Mercury. Now, the Latin name for it is hydrangeurum, which means water silver. And if you think of mercury, it's the only element that is liquid at room temperature. And so it looks silver, it's a silvery color, and it's liquid, so water silver was where its Latin name came from. Mercury revolving around the sun, we know it revolves around the sun. They didn't know that, but they knew it was one of the fastest moving of the wanderers, the ancient planets. And so they named it after the god of Mercury. Named it after after Mercury. You hear it referred to as quicksilver. The quick in quicksilver refers to being alive or living. So quicksilver doesn't mean moving, it means being alive or alive. So one of its early names was argentum vivum, or living silver. And mercury is used in purifying gold. It's one of the few things that will dissolve gold. So when you want to dissolve gold from the ore, you can mix it with mercury. Mercury will dissolve the gold, and then by heating that amalgam, you can distill off the mercury and leave behind purified gold. Problem was that mercury, when it was distilled as a vapor, was highly toxic and poisonous. We used to talk about it on the poison tour. That was a very dangerous occupation. Most people who worked in the mines to get the ores for mercury died because it was such a dangerous place to work. And of course, we know mercury is used in amalgam to make dental fillings before we got all the new modern compounds that we use. So that's where mercury comes from. You saw the symbols I didn't point out, but there's different symbols that you'll see on each of these slides, which are the ancient symbols they used for these different elements. Okay, so iron was associated with the red planet because Mars has a reddish color to it. That's because its iron oxide is the dominant mineral on the surface of Mars, hematite, and has reddish color. Its Latin name is ferrum. Fe is the chemical symbol. And it's thought that the reddish color to Mars reminded the ancients of the blacksmith's forge. And so they associate with weapons of war. And you can see the symbols are a shield and a spear. So that's kind of the association they made with that. We know now that our hemoglobin, which is the red blood cells, has iron in it, and that's what carries the oxygen. And a lack of iron leads to anemia. So the ancients didn't know, of course, any of that, but that's our close association with iron. Lead is associated with Saturn. And Saturn is a lumbering planet. It moves very slow. And because it moves so slow, they associated with a heavy, dense, ponderous metal like lead. It was one of the most heavily mined metals in the ancient world. There is one compound called Magisterium Saturnium, or sugar of lead, which the Romans used to sweeten their wine. And of course, you know, when we talked about in our poison tours about how the Romans were affected because lead is a highly neurotoxic element, and drinking wine that was sweetened by lead caused a lot of the mental and developmental problems in the Roman Empire. You see the symbol there, and it's called Saturn's scythe, and a scythe that has no agricultural significance. It's nothing to do with cutting wheat or grains. It has to do with the tool that Saturn used to emasculate his father. And we'll talk about that in just a moment, about the birth of Venus. So Saturn is noted for consuming all of his children. He ate all of his children from his wife, Rhea, I believe was her name, to prevent them from ever succeeding him as the dominant god. So Jupiter is associated with 10. The chemical symbol for this, of course, 10 is stannum, SN. You can see the symbol, the ancient symbol. It's the largest planet and the brightest after Venus. It's not clear why it's associated with 10. The reasons are lost in antiquity, but it may be that because when you shake a sheet of tin, you get a thunder-like sound, and so maybe that's what it might be. Or it may be that just they had one planet left over and they had one metal left over, and so they had to put them together because there was nothing else left, so by default. Tin is important in the ancient world because it was used in a lot of products that were used by the societies at that time and for making different alloys. So the relationship between Jupiter and Saturn is interesting because it leads to the birth of Venus. So I'll just go tell you I'll read you the little story about the birth of Venus. There was a king of Crete called Saturn. He needed to be removed from his throne. He is recorded as one possessed by frenzy and was so insane that from his wife named Rhea, he seized his own children and made it his usual custom to eat them. But his son Jupiter, grown to full age, because Rhea had hidden him away, grown to full age, bound his father, and with his own hands severed his genitals, which at once he threw into the depths of the sea, on account of which the Greeks claim and record that when they were scattered, Venus was born by this means. So Venus was born from the scattered genitals of Saturn. So Venus is associated with copper. Cu, cuprum is the Latin name. You can see the symbol is what we use as a female symbol, even today. It's named after the Roman goddess of love. The Greek counterpart is Aphrodite. Venereal the word venereal comes from Venus. Copper sulfate was a compound that was used to treat diseases of generation, which were the venereal diseases of the time. She is said to have been born in the waves crashing on Cyprus. She came from the sea, and she's called genial because she came from genitals. The symbol is thought to be either a looking glass or a musical instrument. That's the origin of that. So those are the 7 ancient metals and their association with the different planets. And so we have the 5 planets plus the sun and the moon. So the 7, each associated with a different element. Now, with the development of the telescope, new planets were discovered. And so Uranus, Neptune, Pluto were discovered at various times in the 18th, the 19th, and the 20th century. So some of these elements were given names that were associated with astronomical bodies, Uranus, of course, we get uranium. Neptune is neptunium. Pluto is plutonium. So they continue the process, even though by now science knew much more about the form of the solar system and the nature of the elements and various compounds. But still, they used out of historical tradition some of the astronomical names for some of the metals and other elements that were discovered. Now we're missing one planet. Which planet are we missing? Earth. Okay, so Earth, does it have an element associated with it? Yes, it does. In 1798, a chemist discovered a contaminant of an ore that he didn't recognize. It was related to selenium, and he called it tellurium. Tellurium is from the Roman goddess that personifies the earth, called Tellus. And so Earth does have an element associated with it, and that's Tellus. So those are the metals of antiquity plus the Earth that are associated each with a different metal. There are no naturally occurring elements beyond the element plutonium. Plutonium is number 94 on the periodic table. So let's look at the periodic table for just a moment. This is a simplified form, but it's to show the number of metals in the 118 known elements. So we've got 118 elements. The last one is here in the corner in the lower right-hand side. But the ones in tan are all metals. Okay, and of course only 7 of them were known to the known in antiquity. These are metalloids, which means they have metal-like properties but are not quite the same as true metals. And then the ones in blue here are the non-metal elements, and they fall in different categories. Here's your noble gases: helium, neon, argon, krypton, xenon, and radon. Here are your halogens: fluorine, chlorine, bromine, iodine. And then these are the chemicals that make up most of our life forms: carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur, and selenium. So you can see that most of the elements of the 118 are in fact metals. There's one the interesting thing is that the suffix IUM is generally used to designate. So we talk about sodium and chromium and plutonium, and it's always IUM as a suffix. But there's one that has an IUM at the end that is not a metal, and that's helium. Helium is named after the sun god Helios, and it's not a metal, it's a gas. It's one of the noble gases. And it's the only element that was discovered off-world. So how do you discover an element off-world? They would look at the sun through prisms, and it would separate the light. And they learned to recognize the spectrum of lights that were given off from fire of any kind and from the sun. And the element helium was identified by its spectrum from the sunlight. So helium was actually discovered off-world. So here's the periodic table that we have today with 118 different elements. And I just want to close by pointing out that it is continued to do the tradition of naming some of the elements after astronomical observers. And element number 112 is cupernicium. I keep wanting to call it copernicium, but it's cupernicium. Cupernicium is element 112. It's a synthetic element. Right? All elements above plutonium are synthetic elements. So this element was created in 1996, became the 112th element, and was given in honor of the heliocentric solar system of Copernicus, was given the name cupernicium. It was discovered, it was actually first made in 1996. You make new elements by bombarding other elements with neutrons and various things, and it changes their chemical nature. So here's cupernicium down here. And it's most of these elements in the low ends of the chart are all synthetic elements have very short half-lives. So I started out a couple of years ago talking about phosphorus and giving you a nice long lecture about phosphorus. Now I've covered 13 other elements, so I've got 14 elements down. I only got 104 to go. So if you hang around long enough, maybe we'll finish the rest of the periodic chart. That's it. Thank you very much.
Nice.
Hey, great.
Thanks, Bob. Wow, that was really great. When I was in high school, I wasn't allowed to take a chemistry class because I wasn't college bound. They predetermined that for me. So I've always found the periodic table so interesting. All right. Any other comments or questions before we say adieu?
I'd like to invite